As soon as I graduated with my BA, I went into the philosophy program because I figured if I was going to understand this, I needed a degree in philosophy. So I did that. And then when I finished with the philosophy, I'd always intended, the whole reason was, to do my work in sociology. So then I went back into the sociology department. I wanted to understand Black history, African history, and there's a personal reason. I have a son who's 44 this year, and his father's Black, so in the United States he's Black. And right after he was born, I was visiting my parents, and a neighbor came over, kindly gave me a copy of Wilson's article in the Atlantic Monthly proving that Black people were genetically inferior. I wanted to be able to argue that he was not just morally wrong, but factually wrong. That, Black people weren't inferior in any way at all. Why did I not have the information? And so I immediately went to the library and I got out all of the books on African history I could find. I was very poor. I was a single parent. I had no money. I could enroll in the night school for $30, a course. And so I took courses in Black American politics with Martin Kilson. I studied with Ephraim Isaac, African religion and philosophy. I started to talk and learn about what was happening in Black American politics, Black American history, African history. And so I did that for a couple of years. So I got there and I started taking these courses, and I'd already read enough in African philosophy and Black history to realize that all the books I was being given were Western-centric, that none of them had room in them for the kind of culture and personhood that I knew myself from my 4 years and that I've been reading about. So in my first year at Wheelock, it became a project to try to figure out how to fix theory so that it had room in it for the non-Western selves, the other cultures, the marginal people, so to speak, that were written out of all of those books. Probably we began in 1975, which is not the beginning because I'm already a sociologist at that point, but that's when it's my last year as an undergraduate, and Garfinkel came to Boston University, and I got to study with him that summer. I had written a paper on his trust article. And I'd written a paper on Goffman, a version of the one that I'd published later. So I'd written, already a couple of the papers that got published. And people told me, because this was a theory paper about Garfinkel's trust argument, they said, don't give it to him. He hates it when people write theoretical things about it. But I've never done what I've been told ever. So I gave it to him and he liked it. There are a number of theoretical things that I have written about him over the years and given to him, and they were what I thought. But, one never knows, is he going to like it or not? And it wasn't until I got the archive a couple of years ago, after he died, and I went back and looked through the really early papers, that I discovered that in his own early work, he had written the kinds of things I said he would have written if he'd written theory. I didn't know he had. I think when most people wrote about him theoretically, they wrote about him in more conventional terms, and he, of course, didn't like that. But so it's been interesting to get the archive and see what he was doing in his early days. There was a professor there, Fran Waxler, who had studied at BU, and she'd studied Garfinkel. And she introduced me to his work, which basically is getting beneath, the theoretical frames that imprison you, and looking at what's actually going on so that I could figure out how to rewrite the theories so that they, would take into account the things that I thought they should take into account. It's interesting now that I have his first theory paper from 1946, because what Garfinkel says is that his purpose is to get beyond the problem of ethnocentrism. It's really interesting, because that's what brought me into sociology. It was a way of looking at how people were making the world together, all people, not just the people that fit the paradigm in the books. And then try to, put the pieces together and come up with something that would include everybody. I knew I was going into a male-dominated profession. There are women in sociology, but particularly at that time, usually studying, the family and feminism and so on. And I wanted to be a theorist. So I thought a lot about things that I cared about: presentation of self, how the way you present yourself has to do with, what people see and how they respond to you. And I tried to design for myself a way of being in that environment that would avoid gender stereotypes. It's not really about whether or not it had the effect I wanted it to, although I believe it did, but it made it possible for me to be comfortable doing what I was doing without really thinking about it. I've experienced an enormous amount of discrimination by gender, much of it from women, because I'm not a part of, the feminist group.
Okay.
So I get it from men. I actually get it more from women. It's been somewhat difficult, but I've been very comfortable with who I am and what I'm doing since I sort of worked that out for myself in the beginning, and I just haven't paid much attention.
There is this idea that only black people can study black people, and only women can study women, and how do you see this sort of issue? Because since the very beginning, you were interested in black culture, black philosophy.
So yes, I know that these expectations are very strong, and I know it stops a lot of people from working. I also know if you go into another community and you're not really aware that you're not an insider, you can make big mistakes. So when I do research in the black community, I spend a lot of time with people and get the work critiqued and try to write about how it is that an outsider I come to the understanding that I have. So a lot of it is even about the methodology. How did I have this breakthrough? And they're not easy. It comes little by little. The thing is that when I'm talking about interracial interaction, the black people I'm talking to have the same problem with me, right? So, you know, they have what they don't understand about what white people are doing, and I have what we don't understand. And so there isn't anybody better to do it. You know, we have to do it together. So it has to be done carefully and respectfully, and, you know, with everybody participating. I need to listen. You know, if I'm told I'm wrong, I need to listen. I was going to be a Head Start teacher, so I needed to understand psychology. And I was thinking to myself, you know, this psychology is only about certain kinds of people. You know, there are other people that don't fit this. So it started as a theoretical problem. And then in order to reformulate the theory, I mean, I started reading things theoretically. I read a lot of theoretical stuff, but the empirical work became the way of rewriting, you know, the theories right from the beginning. Well, of course, if you don't know a lot of theoretical stuff to begin with, there are a lot of relevancies, connections, you know, that are hard to make. But I call it empirical theorizing. On the one hand, I have to understand the problem. What are the problems of epistemology? How have people talked about all of these things? But then ultimately, if you ask the question, what makes it possible for people to make sense together? And you start working with actual people and looking at what makes it possible, what makes it impossible. And I had, you know, read Garfinkel's trust paper, and he was talking about what kinds of things make it impossible. And I was thinking about race relations, and I thought, well, too much inequality makes it impossible. And people told me I was wrong. No, there's inequality all over the place, and people talk. And I said, you know, I don't think so. They're talking, but they're not making sense. And so one of the things I wanted to do empirically was to see, can I document that? Because if people can make sense when there's no equality, then I'm wrong. I have to give that theory up. And how am I going to find that? Well, it's very, very difficult. You need natural situations. You can't make them up. You need to try to document. In my dissertation, I used archival records of master-slave interaction, because they all talk about how no matter what you asked a slave, they said yes. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm talking about, right? If there's too much inequality, then you really can't communicate. And so in the South, masters would tell these stories. So they're kept in the archives. And slaves would tell stories about them too. I mean, and in the slaves' version, they would know what the truth was that they couldn't tell. So that becomes part of their story. But the only thing they can tell the master is yes. So the master always gets bad information because the slave can't tell him. And I discovered that the colonial British had the same kinds of stories in India, and I assume that in most colonial countries they do. So that was the best I could do at that point. But, you know, I kept digging. And it was in the 90s that I was able to find things working in interracial interaction that prevent understanding. And then I started publishing and writing about that. It's not having a method, right? And going out, and it's figuring out how can we, you know, how can we figure something out about this? What can we use? Sometimes it's stories, sometimes it's videotapes. I never know where I'm going to trip over it. As life goes on, things happen. And when things happen and I realize it's a thing, oh, that's a thing, then we start to look at it. You can't think it up in advance. You just have to keep your eyes open all the time and see these things. So what Garfinkel's always talking about is, you know, what makes it possible for people to make sense together. And he would talk about rationalities, right? Rationalities being located in situations and practices. Well, here's Durkheim saying human rationality is born in, these social practices. That's where that project started. It really was, it was just like these things that pop up in race relations. I was there in class and, all of a sudden, here's a thing and it's worth pursuing. So it's more me being interested in how theory works, how we got boxed in, to ways that prevent us from asking important questions and seeing important things. So anything, any light that, seeps through, I'll pursue. So in 1987, I had done the interpretation of Goffman that it was that kind of a distinction. But in my dissertation, I'd already been suggesting that maybe Durkheim had that kind of distinction. So I don't see it as a shift. It's pursuing theoretical questions. Well, what I tried to do is what I saw philosophers doing. You spend a lot of time with the work. You don't say things like, I like this part, but I don't like this part. Durkheim's being inconsistent. That's what social theorists tend to do. If you think you like a part and you think you don't like another part, my rule is you're making a mistake. You might have misinterpreted the first part, maybe you misinterpreted the second part, but if it's a great thinker like Durkheim and you think you're finding easy contradictions, it's your problem, it's not his. So you keep working with the text until you can figure out how every step of that argument makes sense, together. It's like any empirical work. To me, it becomes an empirical work. There are pages. They have words on them. And so I'm trying to see, how they can be consistent. What's the order going on here without there being any other project directing it, but just finding the internal coherence. So if I'm looking at an interracial interaction, I'm trying to find the internal coherence and how it's being done, and I'm doing the same thing in a text. I think we're having a huge problem with theory, mostly because most of the people who teach it don't know it. I think that you need to know, philosophy to teach theory. You need to know a lot of theory to teach theory. I have business undergraduates at Bentley. I don't have graduate students. I teach intro to sociology. And in my introductory course, they begin with Durkheim's division of labor. And I use that as the framework for introductory sociology. And they don't read all of it. They read, the introduction. And sometimes they read parts of book 3. And I use that to set up how to think about the difference between modernity and traditional society. I think that classic works very well. You can read 1,000 articles about Goffman's presentation of self, and they're all going to talk about the actor and the actor presenting themselves for others, and they very often mention strategic interaction, but they always begin with the actor. And I let them read it and write a paper for me, and that's what they all do.
Okay.
That's what they all do. And then we put the first paragraph up, and what does it say? When an audience, right? When a person walks into a room and it's about what the audience needs from them as information, so that the audience can figure out what they should do in response. It's not from the perspective of the actor. It's the audience. People need information from you, he's saying. And you have an obligation to give them what they need so that they can make a response that's reasonable, that you're going to understand. And I do the same thing with Durkheim. When they see that every single one of them has got it backwards.
Mm.
They've read it, but somehow they turned it into, it's all from the actor's perspective.
Mm.
And we write it on the board, tell me what it said, you know, and I've got the papers, and we write it on every single line. You know, it's the actor this, the actor that, if you want people to like you, you know, if you want to present yourself in a particular way. And then we look at the paragraph. And so those breakthroughs, I'm trying to teach them to read. Should we teach classical theory? Should we teach contemporary theory? We should teach them to read, right? We shouldn't tell them what's in the books.
Mm.
We should ask them to read the books and then show them how a worldview, you know, the American worldview, whatever it is, will have you reading this book backwards. Every one of you will read it backwards. Isn't that interesting? And most of the scholars who wrote about this book got it backwards just like you did. We put one paragraph up there and it changes everything. And now they're learning about reading. So I'm trying to teach them to think. I'm trying to teach them how to read. So yes, I would teach the classics. I would teach some contemporary work, but more importantly, I would work from primary sources, and I would use these teaching methods to get people to see you weren't reading it. You weren't reading what it said. You were reading what you made it say. We have come close to the moment when what I see as the original Durkheimian message could actually be understood. So I see the potential for a very bright future. It depends on whether or not people can get this message. Because he was saying something very radical that really hasn't been heard yet. Talking about a radical break that modernity was making, saying that if this modern experiment is going to work, we need to do some things, people. We need justice fast. You know, we need to break down boundaries. We need to get rid of classism, racism, inherited wealth. He says all that stuff. Well, we haven't done any of that. What he said was, if we could begin to understand why we need this, then we might actually figure out how to do it. As long as we think we're okay without doing these things, we're not going to bother. But if people who are very wealthy, who depend on the current system, could understand that the thing that's making them wealthy is going to fail if they don't figure out how to solve some of these problems, then we would have a lot of energy, you know, going in the direction we wanted to go in. So social theory has been unpopular because, you know, people were talking about that today, the taken for granted common sense view of individuals and of, you know, what's supporting the system hasn't yet been seriously challenged. Durkheim's intent was to seriously challenge that. And I think maybe enough work got done in the second half of the 20th century that if we put it back together with what Durkheim originally did, we get farther than pragmatism. You know, we have these practices that people are actually using to make the world, and we can show that they require these egalitarian supports. And lots of empirical work is being done that shows that. So the thing is to tie that up theoretically. I think it could be very powerful. And the moment, you know, pragmatism's been, it's in its 20 plus years. So it's about time, you know, for a new thing. Most sociologists still think that consensus is important. They still believe in things like the rule of law. They think that organizational rules are organizing social life. They believe that culture in the form of cultural authorities and beliefs need to play an important organizing function. If you believe all that, then modernity is very scary, because what modernity does is to erode those structures. What Durkheim said was that you need to think a new way. Otherwise, you're going to keep trying to rebuild all that stuff, and you're working against your own best interests. So what you have to do is accept the fact that it's not the loss of all the old stuff. Yes, that's gone. But that the new thing has ordered properties of its own. And you need to figure out what they are. That's what the division of labor says. So you look at Wittgenstein, Garfinkel, Goffman, Sachs, and some of cultural sociology. You know, what are people doing? But they're figuring out what the new order principles are. And they don't come from consensus, and they don't come from institutions. They're coming from the bottom up, right? They're organizing themselves. It's exactly what Durkheim said. He said spontaneous, self-organizing, right? Occupational practices, scientific practices that become, you know, the foundation of a new modern order, that because of the strength of those spontaneous orders, it can do without authority structures. That's where freedom comes from. And so the job of the state, the job of, you know, formal legal systems is to understand what this spontaneous order needs. And basically it needs justice. It needs for the conditions of contract to be guaranteed. That's all. The government is not making order anymore. The government is fulfilling the trust conditions, basically, right, that make it possible for us to make this order for ourselves. And I believe that when you mix enough people together so that you can't share religion anymore and you can't share culture anymore because you just have too much integration, and that's what Durkheim was talking about, right? When the degree of differentiation just gets too much, this is when this spontaneity starts to develop. So I think this idea of, you know, public moral order that interactionists are talking about is what Durkheim meant. And so it's important to figure out what makes it tick. Because if you're going to support the proliferation of that, if we need more and more of that, then you need to figure out how it works. And then what you would do in terms of formal institutions would be to support it. He uses the word translate. He says that the government and the formal institutions need to translate what spontaneously emerges, you know, from beneath. Don't try to organize it, just translate it and translate what its needs are so that you can support it.